IVM.
I had some knowledge of Persia even before my coming. I had read something of your history and geography and formed some idea of your country and your people. So I used to dream of a Persia where bulbuls made love to roses, where in dreamland gardens poets sat around their wine cups and invoked visions of ineffable meanings. But now that I have come to your country, my dream has been formed into a concrete image that finds its permanent place in the inner chambers of my experience. I have visited Sadi's tomb. I have sat beside the resting place of Hafiz and intimately felt his touch in the glimmering green of your woodlands, in blossoming roses. The past age of Persia lent the old world perfume of its own sunny hours of spring, the morning of that day, and the silent voice of your ancient poet filled the silence in the heart of the poet of modern India. Welcome to States of Anarchy, a podcast on global affairs and foreign policy. I'm your host, Hamsini Hariharan. What you just heard was an excerpt from Rabindranath Tagore's recollections after his visit to Iran in 1932. Since then, much has changed on the world stage, and Iran is a very contentious actor through the Cold War and afterwards. India used to be Iran's top oil buyer with the import of 23.5 million tons in 2018-19. But last year, India complied with the US sanctions on Iran and eventually diversified its oil imports across other countries in the Middle East. The sanctions have also impacted India's involvement in the Chabahar port. But how do we even think about Iran? How has history treated India's relations with this contentious country that has for so long been isolated from the West? And what trends should we watch out for in the future? My guest for today is someone I've been meaning to get on the show for a long time now. Sumitha Narayanan Kutty is an Associate Research Fellow with the South Asia Program at the S. Rajaratnam School of International Studies, RSIS, Singapore. She's also a Leverhulme Doctoral Fellow at the Centre for Grand Strategy in the Department of War Studies at King's College London. Her research focuses on India's foreign and security policies across the Indo-Pacific, with special interest in the Middle East. Sumitha's analysis has appeared in peer-reviewed journals, edited volumes, and in the media. She holds multiple degrees in journalism from India and a master's degree in security studies from Georgetown University at Washington, D.C. We'll get to the conversation with Sumitha. But first, a short break to hear from IVM podcasts.
Hello, everybody. Welcome to another awesome week on the IVM Podcast Network. If you aren't following us on social media, please do. We're IVM Podcasts on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. And speaking of Instagram, Niharika Pandey joined Cyrus this week on Cyrus Says. Niharika is the strategic partner manager for Instagram India. Great conversation about the plans for Instagram in India. Karanjit Kaur joined the guys at Uncle Please Sit. Another really interesting conversation about the patriarchy. On Advertising is Dead, old friend Sujata Salwan showed up. Sujata is the founder of LBB. Great conversation she had with Varun. Definitely do check that out as well. Tanvi Lad, who is a nationally ranked badminton player, was on the Habit Code with Ashton Doctor. Great conversation. I would highly recommend that. The Football Football guys are back. They've been back for a few weeks, but definitely do check out their latest episode. Great conversation they had. On Aditi Surana's Absolutely Right, Manju Sara Rajan was the guest, and again, a great conversation was to be had over there. As always, great conversations all across the board. Check out some of the other stuff like Smile India and Know Your Kanun and All Things Policy. All of them had fresh episodes this week, but with that, let's get you back to your show.
Hi, Sumitha. Welcome to States of Anarchy. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you so much for having me, Hamsini. Excited to be here.
I know now that you research on a lot of things. You do stuff on Southeast Asia, you do stuff on the Middle East. How did you sort of also begin your research? I know that you've done a lot of work on Iran in the past. So how did you start looking at stuff in Iran?
So, okay, let's begin with Iran since that's sort of the centerpiece. Quite honestly, it began, I think, one early September evening, sitting in my professor's office. She was my faculty advisor at Georgetown University. I had just freshly come in from India to pursue my master's in security studies there. And she looks at me and goes, "You're Indian. You can travel to Iran. So stop thinking about Pakistan," which honestly I wasn't. That wasn't my, and I'll come to that at a second point. But don't look at Pakistan, look at Iran and do that. That would be your niche. Like look for a niche and go for it. And honestly, that's what I started doing from my second term. I took a course on religion and politics in Iran with Professor Shireen Hunter, a fierce and fantastic scholar. And it was a fantastic introductory course. And I essentially never looked back. I think that's pretty much the story. I was intrigued about Iran as a community, as a society, its politics, which honestly, coming from an Indian background, people say Iranian politics is complex, but when you come from a time, and this is 2011 with like coalition and coalition partners in the Indian government, Iranian politics, it's really engaging and not really as multiplex or complicated as it gets as well. So I think I genuinely enjoyed the whole experience of that introductory course and learning. And of course, instead of security studies, you sort of do the warfare part, the conflicts, the United States and all of those aspects later on as well. Then, as I said, there's a second part to it in the sense that why the Middle East? And this is why I'd gone to Georgetown. My idea was to sort of bridge my India, broad South Asia understanding with the Middle East because I was born there. So the natural, I think, funnily enough, and coming from the state of Kerala in India, which essentially means the Middle East or the Gulf, especially the Gulf states, don't necessarily recede or disappear in your day-to-day life. And so I think it was strongly remaining rooted in the region, in the Middle East, was the second point. That it wasn't surprising maybe that I ended up looking at India and the Middle East, and then of course Iran, interestingly, for the next 6-7 years, even today.
Yeah, for me, this is something that I say often on the podcast, that international relations is often just a way to make sense of the world. And so I can see why you would have sort of gravitated towards focusing on the Middle East as an area. But you also visited Iran, right? Tell me what that was like.
Yes, though, I visited once, which honestly, I feel terrible about because I really wish it was more than once. But this was 2015, late 2015. And honestly, I just went for it. It was more like this is your chance, just grab and go. Because this was the window, like the year when the nuclear deal had just been negotiated, almost getting there. There's a lot of, the general narrative and the situation was positive and optimistic. And it was a good time. Also, I'm, I would be a solo female traveler around Iran. Not that that's not happened before. People have done that even, before that, including my professors in the US who are American have managed to do that in the 2000s when it was Khatami and things were a bit more eased then. But my whole idea was to get this done. This was the window. I essentially wanted to go see for myself as to what India was working on and what was happening there on the ground with the Chabahar port. This may sound a bit as like this one little thing that I actually wanted to go and see if this was a reality, if all the talk for like 2, 3, 4, like a decade that the sport was being developed by India was actually happening or not. And so this is why I did it. I actually took a break from work. I got like research leave and I funded myself and I just went because this was just I thought that was the shot to get it done. Of course, the next 2 years, I really didn't manage to go. And it gets complicated because, as you know, I have an Indian passport, which opens up, I can still travel. But once you want to go to the US or you want to go elsewhere to countries which have complicated relations with Iran, it just gets a bit more tougher to navigate that. And then, of course, after 2018, the nuclear deal, Trump withdrawing, so it was essentially a window of opportunity that I took. And I spent about 10 days there in Tehran, Shiraz, Isfahan, and then actually made it to Chabahar for like a day and a half. And then flew out of Tehran again. So that was the idea of that trip.
That sounds very memorable. And later when we're talking more about geopolitics and Chabahar, I hope you'll also give us your first-hand impressions of that then. But going back into relations between India and Iran, how did they shape up? You mentioned, Indians with passports could at one point still travel to Iran. So let's go back a little maybe to the Cold War. How did relations between India and Iran evolve during this period?
Thanks, Hamsini. Very, very interesting question in the sense that I think a lot more, there is, stuff out there about what goes on I think more so from, the 70s to the 90s. And because this involves diving further backwards into our archives, the stuff is there. I've seen a tiny bit of it, and just a little glimpse I got, just, our Ministry of External Affairs documents tells me that we can get a much stronger and solid story as to how this relationship was, because then it explains a lot as to why it's been the way it has been in contemporary times. So when you look at 1947, if that's our marker, right, independent India's relations with Iran, interestingly, the MEA, even in its annual reports, prioritizes the Middle East first. It actually calls the region Middle East till about from 1949, when it sets out its first report, till like 55, after which like West Asia appears. So that's another interesting bit. But when you look at, there seems to be a lingering mistrust. This was like one of the documents. Like I said, I spent 1 or 2 hours. That's it. I didn't get enough time. So there's a lot of stuff to explore out there on this to sort of suggest that, and I think this primarily to do with the fact that Iran under Shah, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, is the first to officially recognize Pakistan. And in that sense, I think India is already wary in that environment. And there's actually a whole conversation where, with the UN Security Council vote, where they want India to also be a part of the non-permanent bloc, there are 3 countries that vote against India. No one knows which these 3 countries are. But there is this very interesting speculative idea that one of them is Iran. And yeah, so this is just, I think I just put this episode out there to suggest that there is a lot more that we could really dig out on this relationship, because the Cold War, essentially, India and Iran are not seeing eye to eye on many, many things. And this is mainly the period under the Shah, again, when he comes back after the 1953 coup, primarily because he then goes on to join up with the Baghdad Pact, which is later CENTO, and essentially roots himself and roots Iran into the American camp. Nehru is quite disturbed by this whole approach. He calls it a wrong approach, a dangerous approach, and a harmful approach. So we know where the 2 men stand at this time. And when they meet twice in the 50s, in the late 50s, essentially during one visit, there is no joint statement after it. And the second one is just according to one document, essentially is it just didn't go well. So we have these 2 personalities who are not really getting along. Then, of course, you have the 65, India's wars with Pakistan, that's 65 and 71. It's 2 other events or crises, and to look at how Iran reacts. Iran backs Pakistan because Pakistan is a part of CENTO. And therefore, Iran in rhetoric, a lot more 65 in rhetoric, is chides India. It's an aggression. India's aggression is how it's, an act of aggression is what it's termed as. And in the 71 round, it's not just rhetoric, but there's a lot more of material support that comes in, and sort of the American discourse at that time shows this point. Though at the same time, what Iran finds is that when Pakistan gets into these messes, the US does not step in to help Pakistan. So the Shah is disturbed by the fact that the Americans, and as well as the British, sort of take a posture of neutrality in these conflicts that Pakistan is engaged with, despite being a member of CENTO. And that gets him to also recalculate that he can't depend entirely on this. So after 71, in 72, when the Shimla Accord, India and Pakistan, signed the Shimla Accord, the Shah sort of re-gauges and decides that he needs to engage India as well. And there's a bit of a thaw there, a bit of, softening. And then we see a trajectory where, Indira Gandhi is in power, she visits, and her visit to, going back to my visit to Iran, any of the folk that anyone randomly, a stranger, in an airplane, someone sitting next to me in an airplane, everyone remembered, who were in their 50s, or their 60s, remembered Indira Gandhi's visit. So it was a very publicized, a very momentous visit per se, optics-wise, in 74. But what essentially comes out of that is, I think, just the fact that they're talking again in terms of course, the energy relationship is there. But interestingly, also a little bit on the nuclear side, because the Shah is quite interested in developing his own, nuclear like power for program for generation of power or other purposes, and not necessarily weaponization at the time. But he is also exploring that. He's at the same time also talking about, how great powers, or, in the Asia-Pacific situation, in the Indian Ocean region, countries need to come together and work together. against great power, interference, more collective cooperation and security. These kind of ideas are what he's tossing around. Indira Gandhi, I think, is still wary about it. India by then has signed the friendship treaty with Moscow and still quite wary about Iran. So this is how much of the Cold War passes. Then you have the revolution in 1979 where the Shah is overthrown, which India sort of welcomes because it sees as Iran's pushback against great power influence. So it's cautiously optimistic in its language and welcomes it in a sense, which actually after a decade later, after Iran sort of goes through its internal and border wars with Iraq, this new Iran, this Islamic Republic, seems to actually want to engage a lot more with India, primarily because then the end of the Cold War comes in. And this changes calculations on both sides as to how their world stands.
This is very interesting when you think about how this trajectory has taken shape over the years. And on one hand, it's interesting that Pakistan has sort of influenced foreign policies on both sides. And I guess it would also, there's a lot that's also happening with the Shah of Iran, particularly in the 1970s, right? And so this makes me wonder, how much did the US influence politics then? How much did calculations about the Soviet Union influence policy then?
A very interesting question. The US role, which honestly has made more news since India also began, building this closer partnership and rapprochement with the US, which comes in from 2003, right? 2001 to 3 is when it slowly starts building strongly on it. But the United States, I must say honestly, though, it's there's just so many periods in not just the India-Iran relationship, but also trying to look at how Iran looks at Pakistan, India, and looking at the US factor at play. I really wish in English there was more scholarship, certainly on the India-Iran front. It is very, I would say, limited just looking at other regions and that countries that India seems to, that we spend time on does impact how much gets looked into, like how much of it gets looked into in these different lenses of whether it's the US or now China, etc. But I must say that for Iran, I think Iran's bilaterals with Pakistan and Iran's bilateral with India were more specifically that as bilaterals and not really necessarily looking for the Shah. It's not necessarily looking at how the US was playing there. There were considerations within New Delhi and within Tehran to think about that, but they didn't really play that huge role. In fact, it's interesting that, the Shah supports India in the 62 war with China. And then in 65, after he supports Pakistan, his whole rationale talking to the Indian press in an interview is to say, hey, if I didn't do this, Pakistan would be, on China's lap. So in some sense, I need to support Pakistan here. We cannot have Pakistan fall apart. So it's interesting in some sense how maybe it's, China as a neighbor being right there that affects these calculations more so than the United States at that point, which is different from how it is today.
Definitely. And that makes me just wonder, so you sort of see a couple of strands that come up in the relationship during the Cold War, right? You have Pakistan as one, you have energy, you have nuclear issues, perhaps. What would you say are sort of the main points of the relationship today?
Today, essentially, in 2020, it's none of the bits you mentioned right now. It's connectivity and the idea of Chabahar, which is the central piece. India developing this deep sea port in southeastern Iran in the town of Chabahar. That is for the short to medium term, unless there is a significant change in the sanctions environment, where the energy relationship kickstarts again, because India has essentially, and we have, Reuters in the press release the data, we know that India has dropped to zero levels. It's gone with what the Trump administration's maximum pressure campaign dictates. And hence you need the sanctions environment to ease for that second pillar, which used to be the primary pillar of the relationship, to actually get back on track. So right now we have connectivity with Chabahar. And it's not just, India is doing this with this one Iranian port. And the idea is, of course, to connect to Afghanistan. But in the last year, what I've seen the Indian government do and what A.M. Jaishankar do is there seems to be an idea to also push the idea of connecting this port to the region, because you need regional stakeholders to be using this port. India is actually, using the maritime route to get to Chabahar. So you have the whole continental the Central Asian states, along with Afghanistan, which need to also tap into this port for it to have enough traffic and, business, because if you have a port, you need stuff to go through it. So essentially, that's what India's been trying to do, using some political diplomatic capital and selling it and pitching it, and there is interest there. So it's connectivity that I see as the primary piece for at least the short to medium term. And energy can kick back in when the environment eases. Third, which you can see now, and in the last month we had, which sort of surprised many, at 2 high-level visits by the Indian Defense Minister and the Foreign External Affairs Minister or Foreign Minister to Tehran, which sort of was in the backdrop of the the talks, Afghanistan's future. So I think this is a third area that they'll get talking on again, essentially because India is trying to feel and sound out what's happening in the room. So Iran is not on the table. It's not at the peace deal table at all. That's the US doing it, right? Which means Iran's essentially out. But Iran is in the room. It's very much in the room with its networks and its financial dealings, security dealings. It's very much there in the room, and political connections with factions in the Afghan political spectrum. And so India, who was not in the room, is now talking and trying to rebuild these connections and tapping into these networks to understand and figure out what its game plan is as well. So I see some conversations there. Of course, it's mostly going to be behind closed doors, given the situation and the matter. But I think that's the third area we could see this going. But connectivity, yes, I go back to connectivity and Chabahar.
A couple of questions, just because you brought up Afghanistan, as someone who doesn't know too much about the Middle East, what is sort of Iran's stake in the Afghanistan peace talks? How does it affect them?
I'll just touch upon it briefly because it really isn't an area I'm focusing on at the moment either. But the Iranians, we have the 2001 episode, right, where India essentially piggybacks on Iran's and Russia's, plans and connections to overthrow the Taliban. And what changes then, primarily for India and Iran, is the US coming in, which Iran sees as part of the problem and not the solution. So India and Iran disagree there immediately on Afghanistan. And that gets them not talking as much. Also Iran, because, hey, your main rival is right next door in your bordering neighbor. American troops are on the ground there. Iran starts to hedge its bets, and it needs these bargaining chips to survive, to keep its goals and objectives in place. So it actually starts dealing with and sheltering and harboring certain factions of the Taliban, for leverage. There are also, interesting, there are these bilateral differences that Afghanistan and Iran have that sort of also has an effect where it sort of has a backlash on Indian interests and sometimes American interests. So there's that happening. For instance, the Salma Dam that India was building on, this is part of a bilateral water dispute in the Hari Road, the same river between Iran and Afghanistan. And so the Iranians did have at certain times plans to sabotage it, and which, frustrated the Indians because they were building it. And so there are different ways in which Iranian objectives are already and have been diverging from India in Afghanistan. So for Iran, it's about keeping its political chips at play as well. There are certain factions. There used to be the Qanuni faction at one point that Iran was supportive of. So again, I'm not someone following this in the immediate term or even the last 5 years. So but definitely Iran has political chips at play. It has these security ideas at play, and especially in the province of Herat that borders it, it has huge influence there with the governors and, the communities, etc. You also have an interesting strand, which is the philanthropic strand that Iran sort of pumps money through and funds in many countries, including India, through the Imam Khomeini Foundation. And so, they'd be like educational programs, religious programs and things like that. But there's, especially in Herat, there's a huge strategic sort of depth that Iran gets with regard to Afghanistan. And as I mentioned, most of these objectives today diverge from India's.
I'm glad that you went into that, just because I don't have a lot of context about the Iran-Afghanistan relations in general. And going back to connectivity a little bit, as someone who's also looked at Indian foreign policy in detail, I want to get your opinion on this. Is that we used to speak about Sagarmala, and I think there was Project Mosam at one point in time, and then Chabahar, for which I remember we allocated funds for a couple of years and then suddenly dropped out of the External Affairs Ministry's budget. So how do you sort of see these connectivity projects working out, considering India's track record with them?
Okay, so I'll just briefly touch on Sagar, the idea of Sagar, and then Sagar Mala, which I think Sagar Mala is more the domestic, building your domestic capabilities in the ports and port-related infrastructure. But Sagar is essentially, tied very strongly to the Modi government, which, just given the situation, I think was the first to have a very specific, we prioritize the Indian Ocean sort of policy, and putting it in those many words. And, he does this in Mauritius, where he's also inaugurating sort of this coastal radar project and such. So when he's going around the island states in the Southwest Indian Ocean. And the idea is that, for India, the Indian Ocean is not, or even, then you broadly take the Indo-Pacific, the Indo part of it does not end or begin where, let's say the US thinks it does, or maybe, actually would be more closer to where France thinks it does. But for us, it's, the eastern shores of Africa all the way to like Indonesia, Australia, it goes beyond, but essentially also including the Middle East. So when West Asia or the Middle East also comes in the picture, this is where we differ from even the US. It's sort of now where we're trying to, there's more conversation around these geographic differences. But when you look at the Middle East, then, Chabahar essentially also becomes a part of the Indian Ocean strategy, because still it is a deep sea port. It gives you direct access into the Arabian Sea and then the Indian Ocean region. Of course, the second, and what I would still say partly drove the idea of reigniting, let's say, or reinitiating this discussion about the port, which happened in 2012, right? It happens during the Manmohan Singh, the second UPA government, where he meets at the sidelines with his Iranian, counterpart, Ahmadinejad, and Karzai, the Afghan president at the time, in Tehran during the non-aligned summit in August. So in August 2012, he's having this conversation when the US has just hit Iran with one of the strongest, and it still is the harshest sanctions regime that Iran faced that year. And you even have, the US State Department spokesperson coming out and saying, this is something for, regional economic growth and Afghanistan stability. So be it, So that was a very interesting reaction to me. And that's sort of a waiver that India gets at that point. That logic actually still remains, even in the Trump administration today. It could change the further, certain factions push their ideas regarding Iran in Washington, but it stayed, which is why we still have Chabahar in whatever shape or form it is moving at today, despite the sanctions because of that. So going back to Chabahar, and so that's the US sort of trajectory. And then you have Gwadar, which is sitting about 70 kilometers away, in the on Pakistan's coast, on the Makran coast. And so the Chinese angle, like I said, it partly drives it because this idea was always there. Chabahar comes up in, the 2001 to 2003 sort of discussions that India has. It appears in the strategic partnership document it signs in 2003 with Iran. So it's an idea that was there, which was dropped once things just got difficult with India also building ties with the US. And the idea that this is, which is why I stick to saying partly driven by China's presence with Gwadar and, the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor project, is essentially because Chabahar is not an answer to Gwadar in the terms and specifications of the project itself. So, they're not apples and oranges. And that's why I always preface it as saying, China is one of the drivers because, and, we will of course come to that in a bit as to what China is for Iran, what India is for Iran, how these different bilaterals are, how their investment styles, their histories with Iran, all of this, so very different. And then with Pakistan as well, right? What China is for Pakistan is absolutely not what China is for Iran. So essentially, Chabahar is sort of India's answer, India trying to find its alternate route to bypass Pakistan since it doesn't have land access, transit through it, to get to Afghanistan. And then rope in the other Central Asian states to get, more and more traffic going through the port.
Yeah, let's get to China in a bit. But when you visited Chabahar and spent a day and a half there, what was it like?
So honestly, when I thankfully had a local host family, I happened to discover them just through the kindness of strangers in Singapore itself. So when I went to Tehran, which is ordinarily where everyone goes to, we all had, like, if you're visiting still, you go to Tehran, you do like Isfahan, Shiraz, all the culture, the architecture, the history, all of that, Persepolis, the Nakshe-Jahan. So you have all of this. And of course, when I told, my host family, okay, I need to get to Chabahar, it was just a really strange question and place. They were like, why does this young woman want to go to this town that we have never, like, why? But of course, essentially, I was like, how do I explain this? It's like personal curiosity. I need to just see the port. I want to see if there are Indians there, because that's the idea. If you have set these this Indian agenda is already in motion, as, was being speculated and talked about, there needs to be some sort of, at least some team doing a preliminary, study or a feasibility study. There needs to be something. And it's interesting because I did make a visit to the Indian embassy as well. And I got this hilarious response because the officer was mighty amused by my question that, I would like to meet the Indians there. And he just laughs and he says, "What Indians?" It's like, I'm leaving tomorrow, so okay. So essentially it became about me luckily and getting this wonderful guide and taxi driver in Chabahar that the hotel arranged, who was Baloch. And I sort of was also intrigued by some of the historical aspects of it. It was a fishing community, a seafaring community. So you had these trade strands, like, and sort of landmarks of that all around, including a tomb of who's allegedly the saint who came from India and passed away there on the night of his wedding. So there's actually a tomb, and they claim he's, Indian, or from the subcontinent, I would rather put it. But they were pretty sure he was Indian and he came here. So there's so many of these markers connecting the Indian subcontinent to Iran in Chabahar. So, somehow in just some wider sense, it makes so much sense that India is actually investing in this port. But going back to Chabahar and my day and a half there, it intrigued. It was an interesting experience because, like I mentioned, he was, this is in Sistan or Balochistan, which has, the Baloch population there. So very different culture and traditions also at play when you observe them. And, they're dressed in shalwar kameezes, the women are, and the men, so they have their shalwar kameezes on, and they totally get you, because I was also, given how you dress more conservatively, that was like in a long-sleeved, salwar and kurta. And so I think it was a lovely experience. You really felt at home. And I was like, hey, more of us should be here. It kind of makes sense. But of course, you need the economic opportunities and, the strategic opportunities for that. It's also interesting because this town and the region of this province borders Pakistan. So in fact, when I was at this hotel, and I think just how it is when you have single women appearing anywhere, they don't know what you're about. And I would, use the phone to call and, order, I just wanted like tea, which is chai. It's chai in Persian, it's chai in Hindi. Like, so I was like, chai. And I really can't get this wrong. And the person on the other side just wouldn't get me. He just wouldn't get what I was saying. And he passed it on to someone else, and this other male voice comes, and he's like, "Ji haan, aapko chai chahiye kya?" I was like, and he was, a Pakistani employee from the other side. So this is also it's a border town that employs, and actually had better employment opportunities than on the Pakistani Balochistan side. So it was a very interesting, confluence of all of these ideas and memories. I think that day was quite special. And I sort of got to see the port, because that's the whole idea, that there's already a port there. And I think this is important even in a strategic or a business sense, that there was already a base, like a basic port on which that India had to then develop or upgrade into a bigger deep sea port, just the tonnage, etc., had to go up. So I think some of these things, just seeing it, seeing is believing. So you sort of, to me, it was understanding what we were getting our hands into.
Yeah, no, that sounds like a pretty amazing day and a half. And I'm glad you finally found chai. And, this is very interesting because we're talking about Afghanistan and Pakistan and, the US and China. And we haven't really spoken about the rest of the Middle East or West Asia. How do those countries play into the relationship between India and Iran?
So here's one way of, if we reimagine that question, like where have these different other, obviously Arab Gulf countries to be more precise, where do they want to feature in this relationship, right? Honestly, so far they don't. They do not insert themselves into how India goes about its business with Iran. Because, chances are we'll be talking to India more about this bilateral rather than to Iran about the India-Iran bilateral, because, there's enough going on between, let's say, the UAE or Iran, etc., for them to be talking about that first, and a lot more. So, because UAE and Iran do have sort of downgraded but diplomatic relations, so they do hold conversations. So for India, it's been interesting, and we see this oft-repeated line, right? This balance in the Middle East. I would suggest it's today it's not a balance. Essentially, you're pretty much talking, because then it'd be like, let's say, a three-legged stool with the Arab Gulf states having the strongest and the longest one. You have Israel also a strong and long one, and then an Iran one, which is not as strong or long. So it's a very wobbly. There's no balance here as far as I can see. It's a bit and it's too strong a word to use tilt, because that would just the narrative would just go for a toss. But there's a slow swing, or like a tilt or a leaning towards the relationships that are working for India, and it's only natural, where you can transact business, commerce, trade. You can actually talk issues. You don't seem to be disagreeing too much on at least what's mutually of interest to you, and that's the Arab Gulf states and Israel. With Iran, that gets it's definitely more difficult. And so far, if you look at the UAE or Saudi Arabia, India's most important two players within the Gulf, they have not, in as many words said, do not interact with Iran, etc. Because I think they also notice that what works in India's interests may not as much work on Iran's interests. So that divergence is already there. And I think on that note is also that the Arab Gulf states or Middle East, these states generally tend to not sort of impose or push on India's domestic interests or national objectives, etc., because they would like the same to not happen in reverse. So this offhanded approach has really benefited. I must say it really has since 2014. What's helped is this hands-off approach on both sides that has strengthened Arab Gulf and India's relations.
And now just going back a little bit to the US, and I know we've spoken about it in like snatches, but I think something that came up a lot was sort of how the recent sanctions that India chose to comply with, there were a lot of voices pointing out that when the sanctions were enacted, I think in the 2000s, India chose not to comply with them, and we managed to work around them, and we didn't choose to do that today. So when you look at that, it sort of brought the energy cooperation to a grinding halt. Where do we go from here?
So this actually, which I would like to state one last point to the previous question on the Arab Gulf states, is the other way in which they've clearly demonstrated, by not opining on the matter, is by stepping in immediately as soon as Iran's out of the energy mix to say, hey, here's our stuff, and we'll give you our stuff. So there's no problem. New Delhi does not have to worry about where am I going to fill this gap of this particular kind of crude that used to come from, this particular source in Iran. But, you have, either Dubai or someone stepping up and saying, here's our stuff, it works fine. So these are the many small ways in which not just US decisions, but also how these regional players have stepped in and shown their own positions to India on the matter. I thought that was an interesting point to just add that. So for the US, the sanctions story, going ahead, and I'm not a fan of crystal ball gazing, etc. But so they made a dynamic which could ease in rhetoric, and maybe not policy making an action, would be if there's a change in the American administration, right? So come November, if it's Biden who wins, what could that possibly mean, and how that translates into on the ground is what would affect India's calculations vis-a-vis Iranian oil imports. And Biden, so far, I think I see one opinion piece op-ed is written in the CNN on his Iran policy. It essentially says, it says creating a credible path back to diplomacy. And if Iran returns to strict compliance with the nuclear deal, then, and the US also would rejoin it and then follow on negotiations and then work with our allies. The issue now is, even if Biden comes in, I belong to the more skeptic camp as to whether we will have a second nuclear deal and bringing Iran back to the table, I think comes secondary, because I think first Biden will have to sell a nuclear deal to the Congress. He'll have to sell it domestically. What Obama did, and he knew the trade-off, was going ahead with the presidential authorization and not going to Congress because he knew it would not fly there. So this would completely depend on how the American domestic scene pans out. As I said, so then looking at India and its imports today, it's relying on, Iraq has stepped up, Saudi Arabia stepped up, UAE has stepped up. What the 2012 round of sanctions taught us was to diversify even with, the African and the Latin American side of sources and suppliers. And in a sense, we're not missing Iranian crude. What we may be missing is that strategic relationship which came with the crude, but I see as India diversifying its, so to speak, like baskets of cooperation or agenda that can work with Iran. The more baskets you have, I think that's when your relationship is a bit better. So if it was a period where we were only dealing with energy, it was only a buyer-seller relationship talking about oil, that really isn't a strategic relationship. So to me, I think connectivity coming in, that's a new area. It's something to explore. Of course, it's unfortunate that it's at the trade-off is on losing the energy part. But I think the fact that we found some other areas to talk about, to me, will keep the Iran relationship, at least, it's still alive and beating, and that is good. But, on the oil front, India doesn't, and that's the whole point. Even China really doesn't. Everyone's able to make do without Iranian oil at this point. And so that's the reality of the situation.
Yeah, I think it's a really important point that you brought up, talking about sort of the diversification of Indian baskets of trade, because it's something that we should be aiming for rather than just sort of heavily concentrating one area with one country. And now, with me, there's always an elephant in the room, and that elephant is China. And, it often seems to me like we can't talk about Indian foreign policy without speaking about China. And this is particularly true for connectivity that you were speaking of so much, just because of the scale of things that China is supposed to be planning with the Silk Road. So I think earlier this year, we saw reports that said that the Chinese are also investing in and around Chabahar. And that really makes me wonder what this means for sort of India's vision of West Asia, of its relationship with Iran. I know you'd earlier said that, Chabahar is not sort of an alternative to Gwadar, and it's not sort of competing with Gwadar. But what are your opinions about Chinese investments in Iran and in Chabahar?
Certainly, yes. It suits the narrative greatly that, there's Chabahar happening, and, it's fine if this strategic narrative, even if it obfuscates what's the reality, that this is our answer or alternative to our answer to Gwadar, if that's what, calms everyone down a bit. But going back to because the period I visited Iran is when I was also tracking a lot more closely on ground, daily events. And with regard to Chabahar, this is late 2015, you actually had, I think the week after I left, you had the Chinese ambassador visiting Chabahar to sort of look at where China could invest. That was what the report was about. And everyone standing across this. And your one focal point, and the only point in Chabahar where you actually have an English, someone who speaks in English and explains things. And that's his job. Like, he's essentially the guy in the free trade zone who can explain to you what the project is generally about, like what's happening, where you can invest and things. And also talk up as to who all are interested. So, I hear that, he told me the Chinese, of course, the Chinese and the South Koreans and Japanese, all true. I think everyone was quiet. Even the South Koreans and Japanese were interested in that, window of 2015, 16, 17. In fact, Japan also says it'll tag on to India's plans and help. The whole conversation was a lot more optimistic. But in the week, the Chinese ambassador comes and looks, and there's this you're like a model of the free trade zone that he's looking at with everyone. The very next week, there's the Indian ambassador there also looking at that same model as a picture of him. So this is essentially to show you the Chinese were there, but it's pretty much the same level of interest as, in with regards to Chabahar, because it's still, the workings, the beginnings of it, of this port project and the free trade zone around it. They were still building, things to like house businessmen in and, some centers, etc. It was all still beginning out. A bigger project that they had begun discussing with China, like 2014, 15, was this petrochemical complex, a bit off of the port, which to this date has not actually been finalized at all. Like it was always discussions. So that's all. There's this whole, where you talk about something, then you do feasibility studies and you sign an MOU, then you actually get down to a contract and then you start working on that contract. It takes a while. On the Indian side, it takes a while. So you put on the Iranian context, it takes longer because, you have the sanctions, you have like all of these other issues to think about as a business when you're going in. And here's where I definitely want to, it's a good reminder that the same concerns that India has in doing business with Iran are the same concerns almost that China has in doing business with the sanctioned Iran. And China, at no point, even today, even when US-China, when the strategic, the global rivalry, US-China, this rivalry is even at its bitterest moments. China does not use Iran as the bargaining chip. And we need to sort of remember as to, that that's a fact. And which shows that Iran is in its list of priorities, even if it's in the Middle East itself or just generally. This is not the bargaining chip that or the leverage that China uses to prove something. And this also, why I bring this up is in context with this recent news. I believe it was June, July, an unfortunate timing right after the Galwan clashes, where this document on the so-called document on a strategic partnership that Iran and China have finalized is leaked. The document is in Persian, by the way, and it's leaked in Iran. So it's leaked by the Iranian side, which makes huge news in Washington. But at the same time, it makes a lot of news, which people don't realize in India, because this timing is just really not great. So you have this document released. The India-Iran business relationship is always tense and always with moments of renegotiation and bargaining tactics. The general term used with the Iranians is like, they behave like they're in the bazaar. And I just say, we Indians know the bazaar. So it's always, this is happening on the Chabahar project. It's happening on this railway line that they're working on. And there's no MOU, there's nothing yet. There's just still discussions. There's no contract or anything yet. So, and at some point, Iran just starts building. So someone discovered, okay, Iran's already laid out a portion of that railway line that India is technically supposed to be doing. So, this whole fallout in the Indian media and the press at the same time. So you have, the India-China border conflict. You have this project technically, which was entirely not true in terms and conditions wise, but that it had gone out of India's hand. India was losing out to China because, look, China has now signed this very solid strategic partnership where it's going to pump. The figure is $400 billion. And it has now been proved that this figure has appeared from like an obscure British publication, which had nothing, which there's no figure in the document, in the original leaked document, which we still don't know if it is the actual original partnership agreement. And the Chinese state media has not spoken about it as yet. Which brings me to a point that for China, when it looks at the Middle East, it doesn't talk about the Middle East unless it is sort of to also suggest that, other or great powers or fellow great powers have failed there. But on the side, what it does under that rhetoric is that it has built, like it has in many parts of the world, very strong business and strategic relationships with mostly the Arab Gulf states. So, and Iran is coming at a time where it's actually, as a very great document. And I really, really urge whoever can to just go to the Wilson Center. There's this new report that has been put out from the Middle East Center, which looks at the Iran-China, looks at this partnership agreement and as a translation of it, and then also looks at China's investments and activities, and not just in Iran, but also in the UAE, Saudi, and Iraq, because these are the three, actually Iraq and Saudi Arabia, a lot more than the UAE, where it has, building relationships and especially trade and investments, and even arms sometimes, and sort of really documented there. So, the data is there. And I think I really want everyone in New Delhi also to look at this and understand, in a sense, that China's interactions right now with Iran it's pretty much Iran who's trying to catch up or wants this in a situation where it's really under pressure and without any, well, so to call investors or friends, right? So the fact that it was leaked from, from the Iranian, for the Iranian domestic audience's consumption should indicate to us, that there's more to the story than just this big headline, Iran, China have this new deal that's $400 billion being going to be pumped in, and some, they're going to really solidify their defense relationship. And in the document, the defense side talks about joint military exercises, which honestly it's already doing. They had one with Russia also a few, months ago. So it's already happening and not necessarily figuring out any stronger asset-based sort of defense security relationship. So this is more to do with Iran feeling it's not getting its due. It's in the Middle East. These other players are getting so much more from China. It's time I got some too.
I think this is very fascinating. I think it's obviously difficult to be in Iran's position on the world stage. And I know that we don't like crystal gazing, but, in the short and long terms, what do you think are the main things that we should follow? Like you mentioned, the Wilson Center resource, I think, on examining China-Iran relations. What are the things that we should be keeping an eye on?
If I could just first add a little snarky caveat, but I think it's important. Any piece or any sort of document which talks about India and Iran having a very historical civilizational link, and that's what, if it starts talking about this as the great, that historical civilization ties are what hold us together, I think it naturally means that the rest of the piece, it only demonstrates that the relationship today is not strong. I have this, this issue with this narrative, which in fact has also been used in our joint statements, but it sort of really obfuscates what's the actual situation, how the relationship is actually situated, not just today, but, in the last 20, 30 years. So there's just one, I think, I want to put it out there, that this is one way that you get distracted from what is the actual reality. Now, on documents, yes, this Wilson Center one, because I think given our Indian, strategic community and even students or, policymakers to not get embroiled in the emotional and, the rivalry element of it, to look at the Wilson Center report and some work also to understand what these other players are, in fact, because I did have an essay in this compilation with the Indian perspective, but Iran in Eurasia, because there's this whole, which India gets, because India has always looked at Iran in that sphere and not like the Middle East paradigm. But to know what the Russians are up to, what the Chinese are up to, like in one stop, there's this publication that's been put out by Bors and Bazar and the Middle East Institute in the National University of Singapore here. So that's one compilation just for easy access to what different regional players are thinking and the relationship. I think to understand just purely India-Iran relations, like I said, books are, at least the ones I've been able to gain access to and look at the literature. I spent some time because I've been writing, and interestingly, so many female experts and authors in this space. It's just been a real joy to work in, to read their stuff. But of course, you go to Sujata, Dr. Sujata Ashwarya Chima's book on India-Iran relationship. It's from 2016. It's a great volume too, where it has all the data in place for each of these decades. All the it has an appendix, all the joint statements, and so it's a great. It has a lot of data in it that's just useful. You can use to build your own cases, and you can and strands from it. Professor C. Christine Fair has done a lot of work on the India-Iran relationship. Also, mainly talking to an American audience, so it's interesting what kind of aspects she finds interesting to, or fascinating, and or trying to clarify. And I must say, earlier on, Dr. Tanvi Madan did a little bit on the energy side on Iran, and even some pieces she writes for Brookings still on the India-Iran relationship. I love her phrase that it's complicated because that's what the status is always. Then just looking at purely understanding Iran, and this is a book which I encountered during my course at Georgetown, is Modern Iran by Nikki R. Keddy. Modern Iran Roots and Results of Revolution. I think it's a great one-stop, like an Iran 101 political guide for anyone who's just starting out to understand. And I also recommend that if you're following analysts on Twitter, I think you follow them across the spectrum, whether it's, the US narrative across different camps or the European narrative. They're all out there. And I think following all of them, their different ideas and policies, prescriptions would give you a better idea as to where things actually are, because they'd be somewhere in the middle. So once you get all that information. And so I think that would be some bits that I recommend.
Okay, yeah, that's quite comprehensive. I think I'll add it to our show reading list. Yeah. Thank you so much for coming on the show, Sumitha. It was really lovely talking to you.
It was great talking to you as well, Hamsini, and thanks for having me.
That brings us to the end of this episode of States of Anarchy. Thank you for staying with us. Sumitha's recommendations are in the episode bio, so I do recommend checking those out. If you have any questions or comments, don't hesitate to reach out to me at Hamsini H on Twitter and at States of Anarchy on Instagram. States of Anarchy would not be possible without the support of the kind folks at the Takshashila Institution and the Independent Public Spirited Media Foundation. We'd like to thank them for their support. And finally, thank you for listening in week after week and for being kind and considerate with your feedback and your reviews. If you want to help us reach more people, please leave us a rating on iTunes. You can listen to States of Anarchy not only on the IVM Podcast app and website, but on Spotify, iTunes, Ghana, Google Podcast, or whatever you're using right now. Our next episode is on 27th October with Shikha Basin. Till then, stay safe and stay healthy.
Do you wish you were smarter? Well, so do we. But the next best thing?
We could make you sound smarter.
And to help you with this endeavor, we are Simplified, a podcast that attempts to break down the complex world around you with a little knowledge, a lot of poor jokes, and a ton of random trivia.
Episodes out every Monday.
On the IVM Podcast app or wherever you get your podcasts.
See ya!
रिश्ते में तो हम तुम्हारे पॉडकास्ट लगते हैं. नाम है फुटबॉल शुटबॉल.
Presenting Football Shortball, a show about three friends discussing our favorite game over a beer. Sometimes 3, maybe even 5. Hi, I'm Shiva, and with me are my 2 sidekicks, Gaurav Sapre and Karthik Iyer.
Sidekick? You mean like Batman's Robin or Van Persie Robin?
No, I mean like Alexis Sanchez, but with a little more skill than just playing the piano.
Ha! Just shows how the best players at Arsenal are mere bench warmers at United.
Oh, thank you, Iyer. But you're a Fulham supporter, so whenever you say anything to support me, I question my beliefs.
Just like how Griezmann would say, एक बार मैंने जो decision ले लिया, तो मैं अपने आप की भी नहीं सुनता.
Banter aside, we will talk match reports, transfer rumors, top controversies, fantasy football picks, and so much more. So grab a beer and tune in to Football Shortball every Wednesday on the IVM Podcast app, website, or wherever you get your podcasts.